sound different. And that in juveniles, we found no significant additive genetic variants for what baby marmots sound like. We found a lot of maternal effects, which is interesting and suggests a testable hypothesis about the cause of that, which is that the maternal stress environment, how scared the mother is. She's scared she's going to have high glucocorticoid levels. She's scared, has high glucocorticoid levels. She's putting those into her milk. Previous studies we've done show that glucocorticoid levels influence the structure of vocalizations. This may account for these strong maternal effects. Nonetheless, by the time animals became a little older, they sort of matured into their true voice. We could detect significant heritability. If things like this are happening in social network statistics as well, that we might be looking at, maybe heritability is constrained temporally. Okay, so we started getting into a series of analyses looking at the development, the ontogeny of social relationships. This is work with Tina Wei, a former graduate student who's done a lot of the social network statistic work with us. And we looked at what we might call direct interactions, expansiveness, and this is sort of the tendency to initiate interactions with other individuals. Attractiveness, the tendency for animals to interact with you directly. But once you have a network, it's not simply what you do or what others do to you. It's what you do to someone that's connected to others. So the easiest way to think about this is a sexual disease transmission network. You know, whether or not who you're sleeping with, the likelihood that you get a disease isn't simply a function of who you're sleeping with, but also who they've slept with. And you can have super spreaders that have, you know, an inordinate impact on disease spread, for example. But anyway, there are a number of metrics that not only capture direct interactions, but capture sort of how an individual is related directly and indirectly to that whole population. So out closeness is the ability to reach others through short path lengths, and in closeness is the ability to be reached by others. So what we initially found was that age and kinship influence affiliation preference. So we could sort of infer or describe marmots who were friendlier to others in the same age class and that were related. And that's good, because that sort of, this sort of replicates Ken Armitage's results that he inferred from very, very different sorts of data. But we also know that there's, that animals of the same age are more likely to interact than animals of other ages. Less consistent rules about who fight. It was the magnitude of the effect size was smaller, it was still positive. Kinship influences aggression as well. Age and sex influence social tendencies. So older and male marmots are crankier. What do I mean by that? That they're more likely, as they get older, to go out and try to beat up others, and there's a strong effect of sex on being aggressive. Females received more affiliation from more partners, and males initiated more aggression to other partners. So there's sex-specific importance of social relationships. Marmots differ in the nature of their social relationships. These social relationships should be relatively more important for females than for males. And this sort of gave us an opportunity to test a long-standing question in animal behavior, Mark Beckhoff's hypothesis about social cohesion influencing dispersal. So the idea here is that individuals that are more connected with others, that are more cohesive with others, are going to be less likely to disperse. So, as I said before, pretty much all males disperse, although not necessarily over the last decade, but on average about half the females disperse as yearlings. So we see variation, and maybe we can understand this variation and test this social cohesion hypothesis. There are a lot of measures of centrality. And I find it really useful to go to social network experts and try to struggle with them to explain the problems I'm having and what's the best metric for something. So people just calculate stuff because they can. That doesn't mean they should. And we were looking initially at another measure of centrality, and this colleague said, oh, no, you should look at embeddedness. Embeddedness is the idea that it asks the question, how cohesive is your subgroup? So if these are if each of these are an individual, and these are the relationships between them, all of these nodes, all of these individuals have the same degree. Each of them interact with the same number of others. Yet, this individual is highly central, but it has low embeddedness. It's not really embedded the same way that these individuals are embedded in a network of relationships with others. So what we found was that females with a tighter group of friends, if you will, were more likely to stay at home. Dispersal was influenced by affiliative embeddedness. Embeddedness did not influence male dispersal. We could calculate variation in male embeddedness, but it didn't influence the likelihood that they would disperse or not. We can also ask, and I think it's important to ask before we conclude that social network statistics are useful, is we want to know whether there are fitness consequences to these things. So if there are fitness consequences to these traits, then maybe we should begin to pay attention to certain sorts of traits. So sociality, as I've been saying, has many attributes, and these attributes may differentially influence reproductive success. So we used, and many of these are correlated, so you can calculate a whole bunch of these things, and a lot of them are correlated. So we used factor analysis to reduce this set of correlated social network measures to a series of 4 big traits. The first one we call connectivity. This was determined by the degree, number of individuals you're interacting with, out degree, in degree. If you're interacting with more, you're likely to interact out with more and be interacted with by more. Closeness and embeddedness. We defined a second factor as affiliation strength. This was using weighted measures of degree, in degree and out degree. Victimization sort of dropped out as individuals who mostly received aggressive interactions by others, and bullying dropped out as those individuals who sort of, give aggressive interaction to others. What we found is that social variation measured this way may actually have fitness consequences. Interestingly and perversely and interestingly, females with stronger social bonds did not have higher reproductive success. If anything, they had lower reproductive success. The animals are social, but they're not cooperative. If social groups form in good times, over good periods of time when there's sufficient food and animals don't all die, in areas that are sufficiently large, but simply because they form social groups doesn't mean they like being around each other. We could actually find costs of these bonds. Friendlier females, those with stronger affiliation strength, actually had reduced reproductive success. There's a cost to having these affiliated relationships. And this may be a consequence of these greater group sizes in the last decade, we don't know. Being a bully, being more aggressive, enhanced male reproductive success, which is consistent with our understanding of dominance relationships. And a number of other social factors don't influence ectoparasites or endoparasite infections. So, a major cost of sociality is disease, and we've spent too much time and a lot of frustrating time trying to study diseases in these guys. Males have more parasites than females. There's a tendency for animals with higher affiliation strength to have fewer fleas, but it's not that great. So there might be a slight benefit of affiliative relationships. And what I mean by that is that individuals that have affiliated relationships are likely to allogroom, and there's maybe a way that they can reduce the costs of ectoparasites. So all of this really, thinking about these and doing stuff with communication, and I'm thinking that all of these are attributes, and that maybe we need to think about sociality in a very attribute-based way. So I think that the value, as I said, of social network statistics and the social network approach is that you're very precise in how you're defining each of these types of relationships, each of these attributes of sociality. By analogy, I and others have done a number of studies looking at communicative complexity. It makes a lot of sense that species that are more social have more complex communication. either because sociality drives complex communication or because complex communication emerges from being more social. But what do we mean by complex communication, and what do we mean by sociality? And you have to ask the question. You have to be clear on how you're asking a question. So, Kim Pollard and I reviewed some of our work and some other work, and found, and some of the take-home messages are that if you look at ground squirrels, marmots and prairie dogs and ground squirrels, group size drives the evolution of vocal individuality. There's an evolutionary relationship between the number of individuals that you live with and how individualistic your alarm calls are, which makes sense if reliability assessment is an important factor in individuality, which I think it is. However, demographic role variability, I developed Ken Armitage and I, a number of years ago, developed one number to look at social complexity, and it was an information-based statistic that really emphasizes the number and types and variation in demographic roles. So in some of these ground squirrels, everyone disperses after the first year of life. In other species, you have multi-generational families living together. So you can look at variation in the number and types of aged individuals and come up with using information theory, come up with a statistic that really is demographic role complexity. Demographic role complexity seems to be associated with repertoire size, the number of things you say. In other systems, primates, mating systems drive the evolution of complex repertoires and syntax. So I think that, that certainly in how people are thinking, I mean, a lot of people have thought about social evolution, study primates, and these attribute-based approaches isn't the typical way people are thinking about primate social variability. But I think what's interesting is that when one does take an attribute-based approach, I think it really opens the door towards taking a very Tinbergian approach to thinking about sociality. You can ask questions at all levels, as many of which I've referred to today. You can look at the development of these relationships and what influences the development. You can look at the consequence of these relationships. You can look at the evolution of these relationships. And in some cases, you can look at the proximate causation of these relationships. So to wrap up, I think take-home messages are, I think ecological constraints and demographic chance may force animals to live socially, and this can modulate group size. That social interactions in a very Heindian sense emerge from the opportunity to be social. That social network statistics really allow us to quantify precise social attributes. Many of these may be correlated, maybe these can be reduced to larger factors or not, depending upon what you're interested in doing. That some of these social attributes have consequences. In other words, they are useful to understand why we see differences in fitness among individuals. The consequences of sociality may be sex-specific, as we saw in dispersal, and that I think an emergent view, as I just said, fits nicely into a Tinbergian framework, and they structure novel questions about the causes and consequences of social variation. So once again, obrigado, thank you for listening to me. I apologize for knowing no Portuguese, and I've had a great time, and I'm looking for more fun conversations today based on this and other things tonight. So thank you so much for having me.
A gente tem 16 minutos para a discussão. Hilton, oi, Hilton, vem aqui.
Hi, Blumstein. I have a couple of questions. The first, I would like to, when you said that there are great differences between male and females, and you started to look for cooperation in this badgers, when the badgers. My question is, these animals are matrilinear, you say, they have much more affiliative relationships between females. So have you investigated if females cooperate when there is some badger coming, or there are, it could be more, make more sense
So, very, very good question. We were focusing on males here. I haven't done the same experiments with females, but what's interesting when you look at different species of ground squirrels and prairie dogs and marmots is that some of these species really seem to have contagious calling. That when a predator comes through, everyone starts calling. And what's interesting about that is that the pattern of alarm calling can be used to infer something about the function or targets of those alarm calls. So alarm calls could be directed to conspecifics. They could be used to warn relatives. They could be used to create pandemonium. Everyone starts running around and then you can escape. They don't have to be nice things. Or they can be directed to the predator to scare the predator away. I've seen you, you're never going to get me, go away. In the yellow-bellied marmots, we do not see contagious calling. Prairie dog hounds, start putting walking through a prairie dog hound or walking a dog through a prairie dog hound, everyone starts calling. Some species of ground squirrels as well. A lot of individuals call. It's not uncommon to only have one individual calling when a predator is going through, even a big colony. So there doesn't seem the opportunity for that. In a previous study with females, we asked the question, is there, in a Paul Sherman-esque way, is there any evidence of relationships and the sort of amount of potential inclusive fitness around you to influence the frequency with which animals call? So animals find themselves in different size groups with different numbers of kin around, and if kin selection was important, kin selection sensu stricto was important, then individuals surrounded by more kin with more potential inclusive fitness benefits should be more likely to call, assuming calling is risky. Now that's an assumption. I don't think calling is that risky, nonetheless. The only thing we've concluded from this is that everyone calls at low frequencies early in the season, and then after the pups emerge, which are quite vulnerable, only the mothers increase their calling, and pretty much everyone else decreases their calling, suggesting that alarm calling isn't a kin-selected behavior sensu stricto. Sensu lato, I mean, taking care of your kids is kin-selected, but that's not really that interesting. And that's, maternal care is easy to think about. Doing some complex Hamiltonian calculus or arithmetic is a little harder to think about. So I don't think, to answer your question in a long-winded way, I don't think there's cooperation among females too. It would be a good experiment to do, be easy to do. Well, not easy, but it would be good to do.
Thank you. Just another quick one. I don't think I understood very well the heritability of voice, but as I understood it, there is more variability when they're young and less variability when they're old. Is that?
No, it's just the different things explain that variability. So variability when animals are young seems to be explained by the, I don't remember the exact coefficients of variation for the traits. I should look that one up. But the important thing is when you try to decompose those sources of variation, we found significant maternal environmental effects on that variation after controlling for the social group and the year and the dates and a whole bunch of other things. But when they became older, their true voice sort of appeared. The heritable, the additive genetic components of that variation suddenly popped up as being significant, pretty systematically, which is kind of interesting to us.
Does this have any correlation with the dialect in birds, which also have variability in the phase of the development, and then they converge to a add-on dialect?
So what's really interesting about mammal vocalizations compared to bird vocalizations, and this is why organizations like the National Institute of Health have put so much money into birdsong learning studies, is that birds that learn their songs are a really good model for human language development and dysfunction, because most mammals don't learn their vocalizations. Most mammals' vocalizations may change because of ontogenetic structural changes, but not because of experience. Exceptions to that are bats and some marine mammals, but not primates, interestingly. So it doesn't seem to be, it might be development. Baby marmots sound different than bigger and older marmots, in part because of their body size, in that they're smaller and they have higher pitch sounds. When you look at sources of variation within an age class, there seem to be different components driving it.
I have a comment myself. Well, I see no problem with the use of the concept of emergence there. So
I have no problem.
yeah, there would be much more to expand on that, but I don't see any problematic use of the concept. I don't know if Mark agrees. He will say something. But one thing that I was thinking, the model that Novak, Tardit, and Wilson proposed in that very controversial paper of 2010 is a kind of similar to the Hind model. And they tell that the groups, animals form groups for other reasons, several different reasons can aggregate animals. Then you have individual selection that leads then to the emergence of traits that come only from the interaction of the groups, and then group selection enters. So I'm curious to know what you think about these affiliative and agonistic behaviors in groups. These emergent group traits could lead to any kind of group selection in these animals, depending on the variability, because I think the key point is to group selection to work, groups should be much more variable between themselves than the variation within the group.
Yeah, you know, those are questions we're going to ask, and they're on the list of things we want to look at. I think the beauty of social network statistics is finding groups in ways that are very amenable to looking at the consequences of having particular forms of structure. So every year, our groups, the old females are there, the males may be there, but there's a whole suite of other individuals, and we have structural variation between years. So we haven't yet looked at the consequences of that for either individual reproductive success in groups, group reproductive success, likelihood that the group's going to be there the next year, etc. But we're working towards that, and I think that social network statistics give you the tools to look at group-selected phenomena very precisely.
Yeah, just a short comment. This could seems to be a fantastic model to do this kind of study of group selection.
So just to follow up on Charbel's comment on the way the use of emergence. So emergence for you is just an additive property of the group, or is it sort of the sum the whole being more than the sum of the parts? I mean, this is the kind of thing we were, I think Donato is going to talk about more this afternoon, but I think philosophers maybe have a more particular meaning of emergence beyond sort of aggregation. You know, the description of what's happening at the population level as just some kind of aggregate of individual behaviors.
I think I've been using it in a more simplistic term now, but I think that certainly you can't have interactions and relationships until you have individuals together. But then, as Charbel was implying, that you know, you can then look at differences amongst groups of different structures and have the tools to look at that. So I think at some level I'm thinking about it both ways, but at a very simplistic level, kind of simplistic in my thinking, that initially it's that you can have individuals hanging out. You can only have that when you have demographic opportunity, and you needn't necessarily have more complex collaborative processes come out from that.
I shall say that what I got from Dan's talk is that these social group traits are the result of non-additive relationships of the components causes. That's what I got. Maybe I got wrong. Not just aggregation, not just summation. Because this summation then is not really emergent. It should be non-additive. And most groups probably have a mix of additive and non-additive.
What would I look at precisely to quantify additive and non-additive?
What you should look is if the causes are modulating each other.
How would I do that?
Or methodologically.
Let's talk about it.
Yeah, you should. That's a complicated question, but you cannot decompose the variability into just additive components. Or if you decompose the variability into additive components and have something that's lacking, that would be a clue that have some modulation between causes. Other ways to do a mechanistic model and try to understand what causes modulate which other causes, other causes, and then you see that the productive level of the group is a kind of composite of the joint operation of the causes. It's not that the causes give a separate contribution to the effect. But I like one metaphor by Richard Levontin that shows this quite clearly. If you have additive relationships, it's like if you have two what are the name in English for these people who build walls? They are two construction workers. They are doing the work. They are doing a wall for you, and each of them work with the bricks and put separate bricks there. Then you can calculate how much of the wall each of them made. So this is just additive relationship. But if you one puts mortar in the bricks and the other puts the bricks, and then you cannot calculate. They are not additively building the wall. They are non-additively building the wall.
So looking at this interspecific variation in complexity, I'm wondering why complexity is over to the right. Anyway, looking at this, the coalitionary traits idea. So this is trying to explain variation in the number of these coalitionary traits present. You know, there's a significant effect of group size, but there's other things also that influence that. So how would one think about, you know, a quantitative analysis that would begin to tease apart additive and non-additive effects? What would I look for in an analysis? And maybe we
I cannot answer this now. We have to think about how to do that.
That's
complicated.
That would be really fun to do.
That's really fantastic. Mais questões? Temos 3 minutos, Pedro.
Just actually don't have a notion if what I'll say is something that is important to this, but looking for interaction among factors could be the looking for this emergent property. Looking among interaction among factors is basically know how to do it, even if you have continuous variables. I don't know. You have the partial. Is that because
followed correctly? It's just a matter to include the interaction.
Yeah, because as I understood, the result is not only the result of the single influence of one and other factor, but is a result that is linked to the interaction between factors that make something else. Then you can put the interaction factor in the analysis and see if the interaction factor,
So emergent sociality would then be described or demonstrated when group size interacting with something else leads to something particular, not simply group size. That would imply an additive, straight effect of group size.
You lead to something irreducible to the effect of each variable separate.
So, I mean, we certainly have that for some of these traits, because our models are quite complex, and in some cases interactions pop out as being the best models.
There is one funny thing about emergence. Emergence has a lot of literature on and turned into a kind of mystical word that has much more meaning than it should have. Emergence, in fact, is quite simple. I think emergence is just that we're discussing. But when people start thinking about consciousness and start saying incredibly burden of meaning on this word, and the word cannot handle it, cannot really bear that burden. So I think emergence is quite simple. It's just something like that, that we cannot reduce something at the level of the whole to the level of the complement parts. But I would say that we need to have a statistical approach to work with interaction, but we should go for a mechanistic model to understand how these things are really interacting. And I think this would be the next step, so that we understand better why it is emerging. Mais questões?
Thank you very much.
E à tarde retornamos às 2h.